In 1980, American astronomer Carl Sagan appeared on camera and said the following about the Library of Alexandria, which has remained one of history's greatest mysteries ever since. If I could travel back in time, I would definitely go back to find out what happened to the Library of Alexandria. Sagan described this place as the black box of the entire ancient world, hidden within its marble walls. He said it contained the works of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, and hundreds, even thousands of other thinkers whose names we don't know. He also said that religious structures, exploiting people's spiritual feelings in the name of religion, had destroyed this place, setting the world back 1,000 years. It was truly an impressive television broadcast. However, the crucial point here was that Sagan was actually wrong about the destruction. The part where Sagan was wrong wasn't that this place contained a lot of information. It really did contain amazing information. There's nothing wrong with the destruction part. The part that was wrong was the fire. There wasn't a single fire here. This event wasn't caused by a single villain or a massive fire that destroyed this cradle of civilization all at once. The story of how the Library of Alexandria suffered such destruction is far more complex, and in some ways, far more disturbing than the narrative suggests, because there isn't just one villain you can blame in this story. So, what was the cause of the destruction behind the Library of Alexandria? Let's go back to the beginning to understand the issue. Good evening and welcome back to History for Sleep. Tonight, we journey to the edge of the Mediterranean, to a windswept Egyptian shore where a legendary lighthouse guided ships and a great library tried to gather the world. But before we step into those quiet, candle-lit courtyards of memory, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. And before you drift off into a peaceful sleep, I have a quick question for you. Why do you think the human mind is so deeply haunted by the loss of the Library of Alexandria? Is it the tragedy of what was burned, or the terrifying realization that our own collective memory is always just one spark away from vanishing completely? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, please like the video and subscribe. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders soften, and let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow down and let your thoughts drift. Let's begin. To understand what is missing and lost from the Library of Alexandria, it is first necessary to understand what it was and what kind of information it contained. Because it was not an ordinary government building, it was one of the world's largest libraries. Alexandria's library was the largest and most ambitious intellectual project of the ancient world. Existing and written texts were brought here by authors, and this was done not by a single author, but by many. Even if sources were not brought by authors, it was ensured that they were originals before being added. This is a project that would be truly difficult to accomplish even today. This project, the Library of Alexandria, was founded in the early 3rd century BC during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers controlled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great Macedonian king. In 323 BC, at the age of 32, Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, one of the most vast territories in the known world. After this conquest, he divided his empire among his generals, and Ptolemy, one of them, declared the city Alexander had founded on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt as the capital. This city was Alexandria. Ptolemy I, known as Soter, Greek for savior, was a Macedonian Greek who wanted to make Egypt's new capital the most intellectual center of the Mediterranean. He began constructing the Mauseon, a research institution resembling a university today, which housed the Muses, and a large library was attached to it. This attachment was made either during the reign of Ptolemy I or by his son, Ptolemy Roman II. The man credited with organizing the founding of this library was Demetrius of Phaleron. an Athenian politician and student of Aristotle who had been exiled from Athens and eventually sought refuge here instead of arriving at Ptolemy's palace. He had made the suggestion that would make this library the most important place in the world. He told Ptolemy that they should collect books from all over the world. Ptolemy liked this idea. The methods the Ptolemies used to build the collection were extraordinary and in some cases barely distinguishable from theft. Ptolemy Roman III issued a decree that all ships arriving in the harbor of Alexandria were required to surrender any books or scrolls they were carrying. The books were taken to the library, copied by scribes, and then the copies were returned to the owners. The originals stayed in the library. The librarians negotiated with Athens to borrow the official state texts of the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, which were kept in the Athenian state archives. The Athenians required an enormous deposit of silver to guarantee the return of the texts. The Ptolemies paid the deposit, borrowed the texts, had them copied, and then forfeited the deposit and kept the originals. They considered the originals worth more than the silver. The library sent agents across the known world, to Egypt, to Persia, to India, to collect texts in every language. Translations were commissioned. Works that existed only in obscure dialects were brought in and rendered into Greek so they could be read by the scholars who came to study there. The inscription above the shelves in the library, according to ancient sources, read, "The place of the cure of the soul." At its height, the library held somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls. The range of estimates is large because ancient sources disagreed even at the time, and because the library's holdings fluctuated as texts were acquired and lost and copied. But even the lower estimate is an extraordinary quantity of written material for the ancient world. And the scholars who came to work at the library were among the greatest minds of antiquity. Euclid, whose elements laid the foundations of geometry that are still taught in schools today, worked at the library in the early 3rd century BC. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who calculated the circumference of the Earth to within a few percent of the actual figure using shadows and geometry, 2,000 years before the invention of modern measurement tools, was chief librarian around 240 BC. Archimedes of Syracuse, possibly the greatest mathematician and physicist of the ancient world, studied at the library as a young man. The library was where the Septuagint was produced, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that would become the foundation of the Christian Old Testament, as it was known in the early church. It was where scholars worked out the concept of the leap year and the corrections to the calendar that made it accurately track the solar year. It was where the heliocentric theory of the solar system was first seriously proposed by Aristarchus of Samos, who argued that the Earth moved around the Sun 2 centuries before Copernicus proposed the same thing. Most of Aristarchus's own writings are lost. That is one of the facts that should stop you for a moment. The man who first proposed with mathematical argument that the Earth orbited the Sun lived and worked and wrote at the Library of Alexandria. And we know about his heliocentric theory only because other ancient writers mentioned it in their own works. His original writings are gone. That is what the loss of the library means in concrete terms. Not a building, not a fire. The disappearance of the actual words that actual human beings wrote down. Words that contained ideas that would have changed the history of science if they had survived. The library was not one building. This is important to understand because much of the confusion about its destruction comes from treating it as a single structure that either stood or burned. There was the main library, the Royal Library, which was part of the Mausian complex in the royal quarter of the city. And there was a subsidiary library at the Temple of Serapis, called the Serapeum, which held a smaller collection and served as an overflow and public lending library. The Mauseon itself was something like a modern research university. It had lecture halls and gardens, and a dining hall where scholars ate together and debated. It supported perhaps 100 resident scholars at any given time, paid by the state, free to pursue their research. And the collection it housed was the closest thing the ancient world ever had to a universal repository of knowledge. The Ptolemies understood something that is still true today. Knowledge concentrates. The more you have in one place, the more useful it becomes. A scholar studying mathematics could also access texts on astronomy and philosophy and medicine. The conversation between texts across time and culture is what the library made possible. And when that conversation was interrupted, even partially, the consequences were permanent. Because you cannot recreate a text that no longer exists anywhere. And here is something worth knowing about those voices before we get to the question of what happened to them. We know Sophocles wrote 123 plays. 7 survive. We know Aeschylus wrote around 90 plays. 7 survive. We know Aristotle wrote dozens of works intended for a general audience, polished and beautifully written, works that ancient readers considered his finest. None of them survive. What we have are his lecture notes, rough drafts. Internal documents. The books he meant the world to read are gone. The Library of Alexandria held copies of texts that no longer exist anywhere else. And when those copies were lost, the texts were lost forever. That is what was at stake. And now the question of what destroyed them. The story most people know about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria involves Julius Caesar, a harbor fire, and a single catastrophic night in 48 BC. And that story is real. It just is not the whole story. And the part that is real is considerably smaller than most accounts suggest. In 48 BC, Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey, who had fled there after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey was murdered before Caesar arrived, but Caesar stayed in Egypt and became entangled in the conflict between the Egyptian queen Cleopatra Roman 7 and her brother Ptolemy Roman 14, who were fighting for control of the country. Caesar found himself outnumbered and potentially cut off in the royal quarter of the city. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him, he ordered the ships in the harbor set on fire. The fire spread. It jumped from the ships to the docks and from the docks to the waterfront buildings. And somewhere in that fire, according to ancient sources, some of the library's collection burned. The ancient sources disagree about how much burned. Plutarch wrote that the entire library was destroyed. Cassius Dio reported that only warehouses storing books for export were burned. The Roman writer Seneca, writing a century later, described 40,000 books being destroyed. The disagreement among contemporary and near-contemporary sources is itself telling. If the entire library had burned in one spectacular night, it would have been one of the most discussed events in the ancient world. It was not. What was mentioned in scattered references across multiple ancient writers was a significant fire that burned some portion of the library's holdings or its associated warehouses. And here is the key piece of evidence. After 48 BC, the library is still mentioned by writers as a functioning institution. Mark Antony, according to Plutarch, gave Cleopatra the entire collection of 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamon to replenish the Alexandrian library's losses. This would not have made sense if the library had already been entirely destroyed. Augustus Caesar, who came to power after Antony's defeat, is described by ancient sources as having visited the library in Alexandria. The Roman Emperor Claudius in the 1st century had reportedly added a new wing to the library complex. Caesar's fire damaged something. It did not end the library. The library continued for at least 3 more centuries after Julius Caesar, and then there is the Christian story. The second major villain in the standard account of the library's destruction is the early Christian church. The argument goes that as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, Christian authorities systematically destroyed pagan learning, burned books, persecuted philosophers, and ultimately dismantled the library as an institution of knowledge that competed with religious authority. There is a real event at the center of this story. In 391, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued an edict ordering the closing of all pagan temples throughout the empire. In Alexandria, the bishop Theophilus led a campaign against the city's pagan institutions that included the destruction of the Serapeum, the temple of Serapis that housed the subsidiary library. Ancient sources describe the Serapeum being destroyed by a Christian mob. The books and scrolls it contained were likely either destroyed or scattered at that time. This was a real loss, but it was the subsidiary library. The main royal library in the Mausian complex is not described as being destroyed in the same event, and the Mausian itself appears to have continued functioning in some form for decades after 391, and then there is Hypatia. Hypatia was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who taught in Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. She was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician who worked at the Mausian. She herself taught there and was one of the most celebrated scholars of her era. She is sometimes described as the last librarian of Alexandria. In March 415, Hypatia was seized by a Christian mob on the streets of Alexandria. She was dragged from her carriage, taken to a church, stripped, and killed. The ancient sources differ on the precise details of her death, but they agree that it was brutal and that it was politically motivated, connected to a power struggle between the city's Roman prefect, with whom Hypatia was associated, and the patriarch Cyril of Alexandria. Her death is often presented as the symbolic end of the library, but Hypatia was not actually the librarian. She was a scholar and teacher, and the evidence that the library was destroyed in connection with her murder is not strong. What her death does represent is the end of a particular kind of intellectual culture in Alexandria, the culture of pagan Greek scholarship that the library had always been associated with. After 415, the scholars who had maintained that tradition were gone or silenced. Hypatia's death is not the cause of the library's disappearance. It is the symptom of the conditions that caused it. And then there is the Arab conquest. The third major villain in the standard account of the library's destruction is the 7th century Arab general Amr ibn al-As, who conquered Alexandria in 641 AD, and his superior the Caliph Umar, to whom the story attributes the following instruction. Umar is said to have told Amr, "If those books agree with the Quran, they are superfluous. If they disagree with it, they are heretical. In either case, burn them." The story goes on to say that the books from the library were used as fuel to heat the bathhouses of Alexandria for 6 months. This is almost certainly a fabrication. The story first appears in writing in the 12th century, written by a Christian scholar named Bishop Gregory Bar Hebraeus, more than 500 years after the events it purports to describe. No Arab source from the period of the conquest describes this event. No contemporary account from any source describes it. The Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century is reasonably well documented, and the systematic burning of the Great Library of Alexandria would have been the kind of thing people wrote about. Nobody wrote about it at the time. The Arab burning story appears to have been invented during the Crusades, when Christian writers were constructing narratives about the destructiveness of Islamic civilization. It is, as the historian Edward Parsons wrote in his 1952 study The Alexandrian Library, one of the most persistent myths in all of historical writing. The more accurate observation about the Arab conquest is this. By 641 AD, when Amr ibn Alas entered Alexandria, the great library had been declining for 2 centuries. Whatever remained of its collection at that point was almost certainly a shadow of what had existed at the library's height. The Arab conquerors did not burn the library. What they found was probably already largely gone. So if Caesar did not destroy it, and the Christians only partially destroyed part of it, and the Arabs almost certainly did not destroy it at all, then who did? And the answer is the one that Sagan's beautiful television moment could not quite accommodate. Nobody destroyed it. It faded. It was underfunded by Roman emperors who had other priorities. It lost scholars when Alexandria became less politically important. Its papyrus scrolls deteriorated with age and were not consistently replaced or recopied. The institution that had once commanded the resources of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the attention of the greatest minds in the Mediterranean world became, over the course of several centuries, smaller and less important and less well supported. And then one day it was gone. Not in a fire, in a budget meeting and another budget meeting and another one spread across 300 years. And here is the thing about that budget meeting explanation that makes it harder to absorb than a fire. A fire has a villain. A fire has a moment. A fire gives you something to point at and someone to blame. Institutional neglect does not. Institutional neglect is what happens when everyone makes individually reasonable decisions that collectively produce an unreasonable outcome. The emperor who cuts the library's funding has other wars to fight. The administrator who stops replacing deteriorating scrolls has other expenses to manage. The scholar who leaves Alexandria for Rome or Constantinople is going where the work is. Nobody is villainous. Nobody intends the loss. And yet the loss happens, and 2,000 years later we are still counting what is missing. So what exactly did we lose? That is the question that follows the story of the library's disappearance, and it is the question that is hardest to answer. Because the nature of the loss is that we cannot know what we do not have. We can count the gaps, the plays we know existed because other writers mentioned them, the scientific works whose conclusions survived in summaries while the original arguments are gone, the philosophical treatises cited by later philosophers who assumed their readers would know the source. But we cannot know what we do not know we are missing. What we can do is count the edges of the void. Of the 123 plays attributed to Sophocles, 7 survive. Of the roughly 90 plays of Aeschylus, 7 survive. Of the perhaps 44 plays of Euripides, 18 survive. These are the 3 great Athenian tragedians whose works form the foundation of Western dramatic literature. We have about 40 works among them from a total output that ancient sources suggest was closer to 260. We have roughly 15% of what they wrote. And these are the lucky ones. These are the writers whose works were copied and recopied by Byzantium and by medieval monasteries and by the first European printers because they were considered central to education. The works that were considered less central, the works of the hundreds of other playwrights and poets and scientists and historians who wrote in the ancient world, survive in much smaller fractions or not at all. Aristarchus proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system in the 3rd century BC. If his works had survived, the history of astronomy might have been different in ways we cannot precisely calculate. Copernicus, who proposed the same model in 1543, was working 1500 years later and had to rediscover something that had already been discovered and written down and then lost. 1500 years. We do not know what else we rediscovered that had already been discovered and lost. That is the nature of the absence. But here is something worth knowing about the library that changes how you think about the loss. The library was never the only copy of most of what it held. When the Ptolemies sent out agents to collect texts from across the known world, they were collecting texts that existed in other copies elsewhere. The original of a play by Sophocles might have been in Athens before Ptolemy's collectors came for it. Copies were already circulating in the Greek world before the library was built. What the library created was a concentration point. It brought together the best available versions of texts in one place and created a community of scholars who could work across them. The library's value was not primarily as a vault where unique texts were stored. It was as an institution that made knowledge useful and transmissible. When the library declined, the concentration point dissolved. Texts that had been gathered in one place scattered or disappeared. The community of scholars dispersed, and the infrastructure for copying and transmitting texts, the scribes and the organization and the funding, ceased to function. It is the institution that was lost as much as the texts. Luciano Canfora, an Italian classicist who wrote The Vanished Library in 1987, argued that the real catastrophe of the library's loss was not the destruction of unique texts, but the dissolution of a system for producing and transmitting knowledge. The library was a machine for making knowledge useful. When the machine stopped, knowledge became inert, scattered in copies across the Mediterranean, no longer being actively read and studied and built upon. That is the loss that the image of a fire cannot capture. And the loss is not ancient history. In 2003, during the American invasion of Iraq, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted in the days following the fall of the city. Approximately 15,000 objects were stolen or destroyed, including artifacts going back to the earliest Mesopotamian civilizations. American forces had been warned about the museum by archaeologists before the invasion and had not deployed troops to protect it. Donald Rumsfeld, the American Secretary of Defense, was asked about the looting at a press conference. He said, "Stuff happens." In 2003, also in Iraq, the National Library and State Archives in Baghdad were burned. Approximately 1 million books and 10 million documents were destroyed, including irreplaceable records of the Ottoman and monarchical periods of Iraqi history. These were not ancient events. They happened in living memory. And they happened because the people making the decisions had other priorities. Just as the Roman emperors who cut the Library of Alexandria's funding had other priorities. The pattern that produced the loss of the Library of Alexandria is not a pattern that belongs to the ancient world. It is a pattern that repeats. There is now a new Library of Alexandria. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina was built near the site of the ancient library and inaugurated in 2003. It is a spectacular building, a large disc tilted toward the sea, designed by a Norwegian architectural firm. It holds 8 million books. It houses several museums and research institutes and exhibition spaces. It is not the ancient library. The ancient library is not recoverable. The texts that were lost are lost. Aristarchus's original arguments for heliocentrism are not coming back. The 116 plays of Sophocles that do not survive are not coming back. The works of Aristotle that ancient readers considered his finest are not coming back. But the new Bibliotheca Alexandrina represents something worth noting. It represents the recognition that what the ancient library did is worth trying to do again. That the project of collecting and preserving and making accessible as much of human knowledge as possible is a project that is worth the effort and the money. The inscription above the shelves in the ancient library, according to ancient sources, read, the place of the cure of the soul. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina has adopted a similar motto for its contemporary mission: the world's window on Egypt and Egypt's window on the world. Different words, same idea. And here is the honest summary of what happened to the Library of Alexandria. It was built by ambitious rulers who understood that knowledge is power and that concentrating knowledge is a source of power. It was maintained by generations of scholars who used it to do work that still shapes how we think about mathematics and astronomy and medicine and literature. It was damaged by Caesar's fire, though less than the legend suggests. It was damaged by Christian violence against pagan institutions in the 4th and 5th centuries, though not in the single catastrophic night that the legend suggests. It was not burned by Arab conquerors, despite 5 centuries of storytelling that says otherwise. It declined over several centuries as the institution lost funding and political support and the community of scholars who had sustained it. Its papyrus scrolls deteriorated. The texts were not recopied. The scholars went elsewhere, and then it was gone. The historian Diana Delia, writing in the American Historical Review in 1992, described the library's end as one of the most gradual and undramatic endings in the history of ideas. She wrote that the library did not burn. It simply stopped being maintained. And when maintenance stopped, the library became a building with deteriorating scrolls in it, and then the building also eventually stopped being maintained, and then there was nothing dramatic. Just the slow withdrawal of attention and resources from something that had once been considered the most important place in the world. The fire is a better story, but the neglect is the truer warning, because fires can be prevented with buckets of water. Neglect requires something harder. It requires deciding that the preservation of knowledge is more important than whatever else is competing for the same attention and the same money. The Library of Alexandria was lost because at some point enough people made that decision the wrong way. We are still making it, and that is where this story leaves us. Not with a burned building, not with a villain, with a question. What are we not maintaining right now that future generations will mourn the loss of? What is deteriorating through neglect while we are busy with other priorities? The Library of Alexandria does not ask us to blame Julius Caesar or the Christians or the Arabs. It asks us to look at ourselves. So that is the story of the Library of Alexandria. Not a single fire, not a single villain, not a single catastrophic night when everything was lost. A library founded by rulers who wanted to collect every book in the world. A place where Euclid proved his theorems and Eratosthenes measured the earth and Aristarchus argued that the planets moved around the sun. A place where the inscription above the shelves said the place of the cure of the soul. A place that was damaged by Caesar and damaged by Christian violence and was not burned by Arab conquerors despite centuries of storytelling that says otherwise. A place that faded. Through underfunding and neglect and the slow deterioration of papyrus and the departure of scholars to cities where more money was available. Through the ordinary administrative failures of institutions that forgot their purpose. And then it was gone. Carl Sagan stood in front of a camera in 1980 and wished he could go back to the Library of Alexandria. And the feeling behind that wish is not wrong. The Library of Alexandria represents something real and something lost. The idea that knowledge can be gathered and preserved and made available. The idea that the conversation between texts across time and culture is worth sustaining. The idea that the cure of the soul is found in books. Those ideas did not disappear with the library, but they require the same thing the library required: attention, resources, the decision that they matter more than whatever else is competing for the budget. And it is late now. Let Alexandria settle into the dark. Let the Mediterranean move against the coast of Egypt the way it has always moved. Let the Bibliotheca Alexandrina sit on the harbor with its 8 million books, tilted toward the sea, a new attempt at an old idea. The Library of Alexandria is gone. What it knew is mostly gone. The voices that spoke from its shelves are mostly silent, but the question it asks is still alive. Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders drop. I hope you enjoyed this episode of History for Sleep. And if you did, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button and leave a comment below. And I read every comment, and I will be happy to respond. And if you know someone who likes falling asleep to forgotten history, please share this with them. And if you would like more stories like this one, all you need to do is subscribe to History for Sleep. Good night.